What's up, Leafs fans? Welcome back to Leafs Digest. Now, with the new taxi squads being put back into place, Nick Ritchie being waived, clearing waivers, being put on the taxi squad, playing the next day, scoring a goal immediately after he's been put on waivers, people started to get really confused with how do these taxi squads work? How does the injured reserves work? How does the emergency call-ups? What is going on here? I thought there was $1 million maximum for players. It was a confusing situation. Now, if you haven't seen, we put out a bunch of videos talking about Nick Ritchie being put on waivers, clearing waivers, and then the incident with Marner and Engvall being put into COVID protocols and Nick Ritchie getting into the lineup because of that. And it became a very, very confusing situation where we were wondering where his money went, what his cap hit was, how he affects the salary, what happens with the guys on the taxi squad, do they affect the salary? So I have done a bunch of research. We asked you guys if you would be interested in a breakdown of the taxi squads, the salary, moving up and down between the minors. We had a bunch of responses of people telling us, yes, they'd be interested in that. Most notably, Calvin says, yes, do a salary cap analysis and strategy options with the taxi squad and AHL. So we are going to do that. I'll take a deep dive into how this all works. I will have to break it down into numerous different segments to make this as easy as I can to understand, to explain to you guys. If you don't understand after the fact, I completely get it. Let us know in the comments. We can try to answer your questions in the comments after the fact if you still have concerns. But this will be broken down into three parts. The first part being normal waivers, clearing waivers as a one-way player going back down to the minors, how that affects the salary. The second part of this will be the actual taxi squad part. And the final part will be the emergency recall players and how they work. So starting this one off, we will use Nick Ritchie as the most recent example. I have another example in here from Brian Bickle back in 2015-16 as well. I will use those to try to clarify these situations as well here. But if you don't understand anything as well, you can go to Cap Friendly and NHL for more clarification or to support what I'm talking about here, to read along with me as I break this down. So first things first, clearing waivers. What happens when a player on a one-way NHL contract is demoted to the minor leagues, he's put on waivers, and then he clears? Well, because of the 2013 CBA, teams no longer receive a full salary cap wash. They don't completely get out of it once a guy clears waivers going down to the minors. So the rules about how this works, the math and adding it up, I don't know where they got these numbers from, but essentially how it works, you take their AAV for that year, their annual average value, their cap hit for that season. You subtract the league minimum. So let's use an example here of Nick Ritchie, $2.5 million, and you subtract this year's league minimum, $750K. That gives you $1.75 million of him remaining on the Leafs cap hit. But then you also subtract another $375K to get you to $1.375 million. So that is Nick Ritchie's remaining salary hit against the Toronto Maple Leafs cap, $1.375 million. So they escape some of his 2.5, but not all of it. It's meant to not completely let you free of these contracts if no one claims these guys. That is where some of this, why didn't a guy get claimed off of waivers? Well, this is partially why. Because once that guy gets claimed, he is completely absolved from the Leafs salary cap. If Nick Ritchie got claimed, all $2.5 million gone to whichever team claims him. Other teams around the league likely look at the Toronto Maple Leafs, understand their cap situation, and say, if you let that guy go to the minors, the Leafs are paying him $1.375 million. Remember, his AAV minus league minimum minus 375 to get to 1.375. And the Leafs are paying him that to play in the minors on their own salary cap. He still makes $2.5 million every year, but the Leafs salary cap hit is 1.375. I hope I've done that clarification justice and how that works. So they pay him $2.5 million, but their cap hit is 1.375. So that's that first part of it. So back, you want to look at another example. Brian Bickle back in the 2015-16 season was demoted to the AHL by the Chicago Blackhawks. His contract was a $4 million contract, and he ended up still hitting against Chicago Blackhawks salary at 3.05 because you took the league minimum and then you subtract another $375K off of it, and it got him to 3.05. That's how much they were still soaking on their salary cap, even though he was in the minors. He's making his 4, but they're taking 3.05 against the cap. Like this Nick Ritchie situation, the Leafs still have to take on some of his cap. Now, that is waivers for a one-way player and his cap hit. Let's get to the taxi squads. I'm going to be reading some of this right off. That's why I'm looking off to another screen here. I want to get this word for word for you guys of how this works, and I'll give my breakdowns as I go along with it. But coming out of the recent league-wide holiday break, the NHL announced each of the 32 NHL teams is allowed a taxi squad of up to 6 players, maximum 6 players. Now, the reserve squads are intended to prevent any team from playing short of the usual 18 skaters and 2 goaltenders, strictly due to players entering the COVID-19 protocols. This has nothing to do with injuries, a base everyday how your injuries affect you, nothing like that. Strictly based off of COVID-19 protocols and players getting entered into that. The taxi squad option is in effect until at least the league's All-Star break in early February. Now, they could renew this for after the All-Star break and continue it on after that, but until that point, it is only in effect until then. Players on the taxi squad will count as being in the minors for salary cap adjustments, which this basically just means they do not count against the NHL club's salary cap. If you are on the taxi squad, your cap essentially counts as you being buried in the minors. It's no penalty to the team carrying you on their taxi squad to have you on there. The whole reason of the taxi squads is to have players so that they can continue to play games. If it was going to punish a team for the salary cap and say, oh, you have all these guys in COVID protocol, and you need guys on the taxi squad, and it's going to hit against your cap, it's going to ruin teams, and they're not going to be able to play anyways. So you remove them from the salary cap, and they are able to play on there essentially free of the team's salary cap. Now, if you want to see how this works out, you go to Cap Friendly. You can see on the Leafs roster, Joey Anderson, Alex Biega, and Michael Hutchison are all counting as $0 towards the Leafs cap. They're on the taxi squad. They do not count against the Leafs cap. They are free of that. They are absolved of those guys' cap hits. They're free. The Leafs do not have to worry about them hitting against the cap. They just get to stay with the team. Now, another part of this is that the players on the taxi squad, while they are on the taxi squad, cannot play with their minor league clubs. No practices, no games, no team events, nothing. You are strictly with the big club while you are on the taxi squad. So, they can remain on the reserve squad for a maximum of 20 days. Now, what happens is this is a cumulative 20 days. This is not a 20 days, send them down, bring them back up, restart their clock. You can only put those guys on there for 20 cumulative days. So you could have a guy for 5, you switch him out for another guy for 5, and then you rotate back and forth. My assumption is that this is to make sure that guys are still being able to play games despite being on the taxi squad, and making sure they don't just get stuck with a club for an entire season and then they end up with them and you're not getting any games and you're just sitting there the whole time. And then on the flip side of it, it's also to prevent against having a really, really good player from the minors sit on your taxi squad and just play the entire season with you as part of your taxi squad. There's kind of the two things they're trying to avoid between the CBA, the NHLPA, and the NHL owners, trying to make sure that situation gets avoided. Now, they can go on there for 20 cumulative days, but this is until the All-Star break. So if they reach 20 before the All-Star break, after the All-Star break, if they choose to renew the taxi squads and keep them going, those players' clocks will again reset with the taxi squad rules being reset then. So that is how that is going to work. Now, the important piece of information here to take away from this for the Leafs specifically and for other people who are watching this with one-way players getting put on taxi squads on their team, when I talk about how they went on to still count against the cap, like Nick Ritchie's 1.375, that is the only cap hit the Leafs maintain while he's on the taxi squad. They only absorb his 1.375, and it has nothing to do with him being put on the taxi squad. It's strictly based off of the NHL's CBA rules that were put into place in 2013 of him getting sent down and how that affects their cap as the time passes. It has nothing to do with the taxi squad. While he's on the taxi squad, he technically is $0 against the cap. Where the separation comes is from when he got sent down before. That is where his 1.375 hit against the cap comes into play here. That is why he would still count against the cap at all. The Leafs aren't completely absolved of it. They're not completely free of his entire 2.5 mil AAV cap hit. Moving on from taxi squads, the final part of this video, emergency recalls. This is where people were getting confused with things. The emergency recall is where you have the rule of a player only being able to make $1 million. It was $850,000, and they upped it to $1 million. The NHL announced this increase. The emergency call-ups allow teams to ice a full roster of skaters, typically 12 forwards, 6 defensemen, and 2 goalies on sudden notice for injury purposes. Now, where this comes into play is you're not having guys come up for emergency recalls based on COVID protocols. Guys getting put into the taxi squad for the COVID situations. And then most notably, you can look at this. Brett Seney was brought up to play against Colorado on emergency recall because Ondrej Kase was out with injury, and it was a short-term injury. If he was on a long-term injury reserve, you would bring up a player that would have to actually fit into your cap because Kase would be taken off, you put on LTIR, and his cap hit would no longer count against the team's salary. That's the best way I think I can explain that one. If Kase was on long-term reserve, he's put into that, his cap hit no longer counts. You bring up a player that replaces him, his cap fits in. Emergency recall does not count against your cap. You can only play for 2 games, and it is for a player on short-term injury emergency basis. Kase goes out, you can't get another guy in here because you've got guys on COVID protocols. You're short man from that perspective. You bring up Brett Seney, plays on emergency basis. He's able to slip into the lineup and fill in for another guy who's being out on a short-term basis. This is where that situation is coming from there. That is why this guy was able to get in there, and it does not count against the Leafs cap hit. Now, just remember too, with the emergency recalls, a player can only play up to 2 games with the big club on emergency recall. At that point, they have to be sent down, which is, as I mentioned, to go along with if a player is on a short-term injury basis, on an emergency basis, you can call that guy up, plays 2 games, goes back down. If it goes past 2 games, that's when it starts to count against your cap, and it's to prohibit players and teams from putting guys on the ice for an extended period of time at a much more significant financial value and being able to get away with having them not count against your cap. So I think I've done a pretty decent job of explaining in the most basic terms I possibly could the cap, the minors situations, players being waived off a one-way contract, the taxi squads, as well as the emergency recalls. If you have questions, let us know in the comments. I'll do my best to get through them all and explain them as best I can in the comment sections. But Leafs fans, hopefully you guys enjoyed this breakdown. And one final piece of information before you go. I found this while I was doing the research, looking for the information about this. If you're wondering about the origin of the term taxi squad, it derives from the Cleveland Browns Pro Football Club. The Browns' legendary coach in the 1940s, Paul Brown, came up with the idea of keeping promising players who didn't make the Browns to be available in case of injury or illness. The Browns owner operated a taxi company, and he employed those reserve players via the taxi company rather than the football team, but none of them actually drove cabs. They were all just football players listed as taxi cab employees, and they were getting paid, and they were able to play if guys went out with injury just so they could stick around the club. But hey, that is just a cool piece of information, not much relevance to the NHL, just where the name derives from. And again, if you guys have any questions, let us know in the comments. We will do our best to answer them. Hopefully this breakdown was solid of how the taxi squad works, the emergency recalls, and players being put into minors. As more news breaks on this channel, we will let you guys know. So make sure you hit that subscribe button, like and comment on these videos. We appreciate your support. Leafs fans, keep believing.